Thank you, everybody, for coming. Perhaps I can begin by thanking my hosts for the invitation. This is a unique lecture series and at a very important institution, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Okay, so I guess my discussion with you this evening is really a story about liberal citizenship. And my title...
I will sit there so that they...
Please. And my title is a question, and the question is, well, where does liberal citizenship stand after the multicultural critique? And I suppose that liberal accounts of citizenship are ever present. They're still normatively very salient. And so my paper is a kind of a critical inquiry into this topic. So let's begin with the view that liberal citizenship is a contested settlement, one that's ideally modified and adjusted over time and spans both civil society and state political arenas. Now, I think this would seem a very modest and sedate claim about liberal citizenship when we set it against that once famously made by the late Ernest Gallner, who said that liberal citizenship is a miracle. It's not easily explained. It's neither a natural state of being, nor is it a divine gift, yet simultaneously it frees us from the tyranny of our kin and kith, and also frees us from the tyranny of ideologues. Now, this is Ernest Gallner in a kind of in a modestly combative mode, contrasting liberal citizenship with, in the title of his title of his book, Muslim Society, which was in the singular. Now, the late Ernest Gallner took the view that when it came to try to grasp what kinds of authority a sovereign, there's a common secular resistant pattern of social organization in Muslim societies, born of perhaps Islam's alleged over-reliance on scripture, in contrast to Christianity's dualism between church and state. Now, I've never found that entirely persuasive, and I guess my view is that those who find in this view of liberal citizenship by Ernest Gallner a kind of robust resource to talk about muscular liberalism tend to confuse the miracle that Ernest Gallner was talking about with the sentiment that, well, this is how we do things here, which I think itself is a kind of a cousin of the tyranny of ideology. My kind of starting position is to say that if liberal citizenship is to be persuasive, then it has to furnish us with a kind of a principled pragmatism. Pragmatism because it's responsive to changing need, changing environments, changing populations. And principled because it has to tell us how new thinking respects and reflects quite foundational liberal values. So I sometimes point to this book by the late Bernard Williams, which was published after he passed away. In the beginning was the deed. And in this book, Bernard Williams cautions us never to be so arrogant to assume that we found a persuasive answer to Thomas Hobbes's very first question, which was, how do we live together in mutual security? Now, if we understand that question as one that citizenship strategies are kind of minimally appealing to, then I think we can show how, in the main, liberal citizenship has been broadly successful in multiracial and multi-ethnic societies. But that seems like a very low threshold to me, because liberal citizenship has to be about much more, surely, than civil peace. And that's where multiculturalism comes in. And my prevailing assumption, I suppose, is that citizenship and multiculturalism have gone hand in hand, probably for much longer than we've been using the term multiculturalism, and sometimes now rejecting the term multiculturalism. In my reading, multicultural citizenship sits firmly within a matrix of principles that are central to contemporary liberal democracies, in a way that establishes multiculturalism as a child of liberal egalitarianism. But just like any child, it's not simply the faithful reproduction of its parents. So that's what an advocate like me would say. What does a serious and scholarly critic of multiculturalism say? Well, there's probably none more serious nor scholarly than the late Brian Barry in his book Culture and Equality, which was one of the leading intellectual responses to the tradition of thinking about multicultural citizenship, which came out of the Anglophone literature, particularly people like Will Kimlicker and others. And Brian Barry argued, he said, if we take a broad definition, then actually multiculturalism and liberalism are broadly compatible. But multiculturalists boast that they innovate with something, and that's where my tolerance really comes to an end. Note here in this statement that Barry uses the term equal treatment quite intentionally. Because Barry wasn't in favour of what we might think of as group-specific instruments in order to, in Ronald Dworkin's terms, the American political philosopher, in order to treat people equally. So there's an important distinction. Equal treatment and treating people equally. Equal treatment for Brian Barry means equality as uniformity. Everybody gets the same and is treated the same. For Ronald Dworkin, treating people equally means taking their context and history into account. So Ronald Dworkin, as a liberal political philosopher, made a very persuasive case for affirmative action, which meant treating people not equally, but taking historical context into account. Nonetheless, I would say that even Brian Barry kind of approaches, concedes that multicultural citizenship, has this kind of relationship to liberal egalitarianism. In Jim Tully's words, in this book, Public Philosophy in a New Key, multiculturalism establishes what we might call a third-generation norm of legitimacy, namely respect for cultural diversity, which needs to be considered equally on a par with first- and second-generation norms of legitimacy, and so modify how we talk about free and equal treatment. Jim Tully says that first-generation norms of legitimacy around freedom give rise to political debates about liberty. Second-generation norms about justice give rise to debates about equality. Third-generation norms around recognition give rise to debates about multiculturalism. So there's kind of a teleological feature to these. Now, I guess my interest is very much with this third-generation norm and with its implication for a concept of liberal citizenship. And this is something which has to include the view that individuals, that social life consists of individuals as well as groups. Amy Gutman, the American writer, declared more than 2 decades ago, it's hard to find a democratic or democratizing society that's not the site of some quite significant controversy over how and whether its institutions should be better reorganized to recognize the identities of cultural and disadvantaged minorities. So just as the argument for social democracy relies on more than liberal citizenship, because it has to take in economic inequality, so does the argument for multiculturalism. And one implication of this is that integration isn't a one-way process. There's a dynamic quality to it, that it means something about reforming the whole, reforming citizenship, reforming national identity, reforming common membership. That's not integration in one way, that's integration in at least 2 and more ways. But here, I think, when we talk about multicultural citizenship, we quickly encounter what we might think of as a plurality of pluralisms, insofar as, in Homi Bhabha's term, multiculturalism becomes a portmanteau term. And by portmanteau, he means it's like a giant suitcase. It carries a lot within it. Because I think multiculturalism simultaneously describes the fact of pluralism, a kind of secondly, a moral stance on whether pluralism is desirable, and then thirdly, the types and the ways in which the state should kind of proceed or recognize multiculturalism. But in addition to being a portmanteau term, it's also quite polysemic, and by that it means different things to different people. It's one word with multiple simultaneous meanings. And that's true of its theoretical contribution as well as its public discourses. In federal Canada, it refers to, in federal Canada, it applies to groups with territorial claims, First Nations, who see themselves very much as nations rather than First Nations and settler nations, who see themselves as very much as nations rather than as ethno-cultural minorities. In the European Union, of course, Catalans and Scots think of themselves, quite rightly, as nations. Multiculturalism has become much more about what we might think of as post-immigration politics. There's a wonderful paper by Zollberg and Aristotle, some of you might know it, and it's entitled Why Islam is Like Spanish. And when I read the paper, I realized that it wasn't a story about Moorish Spain. It was a story about how the public controversies in Europe center much more on religion, whereas in North America they center much more on language-based ethnicity claims. And indeed, in the US, language-based ethnicity is very much the major claim. In Western Europe, the conjunction of the terms immigration and culture often invokes the Muslim in the mind. Now, in the past, especially in the US, political terms such as multiculturalism and the Rainbow Coalition are meant to kind of include all groups that are marked by difference, quote unquote. So anything which deviates from the mainstream majority, what's often considered in North American traditions as WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Tariq Madood has put it nicely when he said, it's much better to acknowledge that the multi-component in multiculturalism encompasses very different kinds of groups and doesn't necessarily privilege one kind. And when we talk about recognition, which flows from multiculturalism, it should be given to the identities of marginalized groups and the kinds of identities that they find strength in, you know, whether they are linguistic, whether they are religious, or whether they are another form of ethno-cultural identity. But nonetheless, a very broad set of criticisms of multiculturalism have developed and persist and have quite an important, potent political force. If I summarize some of them, some people have argued that multiculturalism has led to social fragmentation insofar as the residential settlement of some groups has meant ghettoization or urban segregation or other means of minorities living in silos. Other people argue that multiculturalism displaces an interest in socioeconomic inequality. We should be talking about class, not culture, which is very much an argument that Brian Barry puts forward. Others more tend to be more from the right, take the view that it's encouraged a kind of a moral hesitancy amongst native quote-unquote populations. So when a few years ago the Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK talked about the status of Sharia in relation to English civil law, it was very forthrightly said that that would undermine our moral purpose as a nation. Others argue that multiculturalism is responsible for international terrorism, of course. Now, what I find interesting is that there hasn't been a single kind of beneficiary of this critique of multicultural citizenship. There's been a variety of ways in which people who say they're interested in reconciling unity and diversity have benefited from the critique. Some people see the critique feeding into debates about a resurgent emphasis on national identity. Some people talk about the place of civicness and civics and citizenship education and so forth. Others also talk about resurgent muscular liberalism. But what's especially striking to me is that people who advocate diversity approaches too have very much benefited from this critique of multiculturalism. Paul Gilroy, who was a big advocate of multicultural and anti-racist thinking in the 1980s and early 90s, has kind of made this argument where he says he advocates a kind of a cosmopolitanism, which is very diversity-friendly, but it's ultimately about having a multiculturalism without groups. And so he puts forward this notion of multiculture. And he says this multiculture has emerged in urban settings where different minority groups who have lived together, forged common lives, been creative, have developed something that, can't be developed at a state level. And it's here, this conviviality, which will take up from where multiculturalism has broken down. But we can see this kind of way in which cosmopolitanism is being deployed as a means of thinking about multiculturalism without groups, not just in the work on urban cities and multiculture, but you also see it in actually quite high-profile European-level policy documents. The white paper on intercultural dialogue some years ago very much put forward this thesis when it argued that the weaknesses inherent in multiculturalism mean that those of us who are diversity-friendly and don't think assimilation is the answer need to rethink how we're approaching reconciling unity and diversity. So they put forward this notion of interculturalism as a means to do the work that they think multiculturalism is failing to do. It's something which pops up in the UNESCO World Report on cultural diversity, and it retains many of the central features. When we've tried to tell a story about interculturalism and its development in Europe and North America, we find it pops up quite frequently now in German, Greek, Spanish education programs, in Belgian and Quebec commissions, the Bouchard-Taylor report on interculturalism in Quebec. It's in as diverse a place as Russian teaching on world cultures, as well as very prominently, actually, in Latin American debates on bilingualism. 2008 was, of course, the year of intercultural dialogue, in case you missed it. And so when we've looked at the way in which the critique of multiculturalism has benefited the intercultural argument, we've kind of asked these inductive questions. Is interculturalism an updated form of multiculturalism? If so, what's being updated? If not, how and in what ways is interculturalism different to multiculturalism? And in a recent book with colleagues Tariq Madood and Ricard Zapata Barrero, we tried to tell this story. I'm going to come back to that slide. In multiculturalism and interculturalism, debating the dividing lines. And here there's kind of four ways in which we find that interculturalism is being positively contrasted with multiculturalism. The first is an emphasis on dialogue. It's said that interculturalism ensures a conversation, whereas multiculturalism is more likely to achieve silence. Because of the inter, which suggests some kind of engagement, whereas multiculturalism is quite happy to allow people to live in silos. So goes the claim. Secondly, that interculturalism is able to focus on individuals rather than groups, which is back to this kind of liberal citizenship emphasis on autonomy. Whereas multiculturalism is quite happy to think about public policy in terms of groups and communities. Interculturalism wants to emphasize the importance of individuals. Thirdly, that interculturalism is interested in the big commonalities: national identity, citizenship, common membership, whereas multiculturalism is asymmetrical. It focuses too much on the minorities. And finally, that interculturalism is able to critique in a way that multiculturalism didn't. Critique of minority cultural practices which are deemed to be illiberal. Now, multiculturalists don't respond to this, don't take this lying down. They have a very robust response to it. They argue that multiculturalism is all about the dialogue. The dialogic is central to it. They say that multiculturalism doesn't ignore individuals. It just doesn't treat group outcomes as a reflection of individual choices. Multiculturalists say they've always been interested in remaking common membership, national identity especially, that national identity isn't the preserve of a majority, that actually it needs to be made and remade to include others. And finally, that multiculturalism is all about giving minorities a voice. So how can that not follow on that it also engenders modes of critique? But if we hang on this theme for a minute and think about the ways in which multiculturalism has been critiqued by people who are diversity-friendly, they're pro-diversity, they want to recognize diversity, we find that in addition to the multicultural argument and in addition to the intercultural argument, it's kind of elevated to this kind of slightly comic social theory perspective put forward by the late Ulrich Beck, where he characterized multiculturalism as a zombie category. A zombie category in his mind was a living dead category which continues to govern our thinking, but isn't really able to capture the contemporary milieu. His fuller argument about multiculturalism was that for all its assertions of a variety of plurality, actually it ghettoizes people. I won't read the full quote. I would only draw your attention to the one in particular, which is quite striking, which is where he says, naturally against imperialism and also against miscegenation, internationalization and cosmopolitanism. According to the multicultural premise, the individual does not exist. He, gendered, is a mere epiphenomenon of his culture. Now, what I'm always struck by in reading that and reading the critique of other diversity-friendly critics of multiculturalism is that they don't really take multiculturalism on its own terms. They don't refer to multiculturalist advocates or their writings, and they don't refer to multiculturalist policy. So my first question in response is always the empirical one. Well, where has this been said, and how has it been developed? Well, if we look at a small island in the North Sea, also known as the UK, we find that actually multiculturalism was never about division or segregation. This was the statement from Lord Swan, who led a commission on multicultural education in the 1980s, and for a long time it served as the leading public policy statement on what multiculturalism may or may not look like. There are no multicultural laws in Britain. There was just a policy agenda which was operating at the local and national level. And he argued that multiculturalism was something that allowed all ethnic groups, minority and majority, to integrate and participate fully in shaping society, whilst also allowing, and where necessary, assisting ethnic minorities in maintaining ethnic identities within a framework of commonly accepted values. When we go back a little further, we find that the legislative framework for multiculturalism in the UK actually has an older provenance. It's tied in with the work of Roy Jenkins, who was a Home Secretary. And in his short time as Minister for the Interior, or the Home Secretary, he decriminalised abortion, decriminalised homosexuality, and introduced gender discrimination legislation and race relations legislation. And he kind of saw them as going broadly hand in hand with this conception of equality, which was about treating people equally. And he said multicultural integration comprised not a flattening process of assimilation, but equal opportunity, coupled with cultural diversity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. Now, this is something which didn't proceed with a charter, like the Canadians, or a single act, like the Australians, but it's something that informed policy at local and national levels. And it took in a kind of a US race-centered approach with colour at the time, but it combined it with a kind of a UK focus on multi-faithism, so religious pluralism. In many respects, there's a kind of a shadow history of multiculturalism in my own country, which commences with Catholic emancipation, with Jewish migration, and in many respects, the post-Second World War migrants came into that settlement. Again, this kind of uneasy and unfinished settlement. There's always a nice phrase that I use from Roy Jenkins, which is, again, very prescient, written in 1967. This is the goal. You know, we may fall short of it, full attainment, as have other communities, both past and in the present, but if we are to maintain any sort of world reputation for civilized living and social cohesion, we must get far nearer to it, far nearer to its achievement than is the case today. Again, this is a post-imperial country coming to terms with the end of empire, invoking a notion of multicultural citizenship as a means of reconciling unity and diversity for migrants who have come from what we now call the Commonwealth. So my point about, well, what does multicultural policy actually look like? Is it something which enfranchises minority groups to be divided and segregate themselves? Well, no, not really. When we look at multicultural policy, we find that it often consists of group-specific instruments, yes, but to outlaw discrimination and promote monitoring and recognition. So I've put these two pictures up at the bottom. One of them is Ronald Dworkin, who I said at the beginning gives us this difference between equal treatment, equality of uniformity, and treating people equally, which is about taking context into account. And in the UK, historically, the multiculturalist approaches went hand in hand with what we now call intersectionalism. It went hand in hand with sex discrimination legislation, what was called the Fair Employment Northern Ireland Act, which is really about religious sectarian discrimination, disability discrimination, and race race relations legislation kind of weaved a path through all of that. And it's something which meant to cover all kind of public areas, as well as private areas in terms of the consumption of goods and services. And it took the form of what you might call positive action, not affirmative action, not quotas, but being proactive and ensuring that, human resources departments weren't discriminating indirectly against employees. And it meant that by 2010, when the last Labour government left office, we had what was called an intersectional public duty, which put the emphasis on kind of ensuring equality and promoting monitoring across everything in a way in which wasn't just about race or just about religion, but about gender, about disability, and about other areas of discrimination too. So I guess I think it's hard to ignore the way in which, when we talk about multicultural citizenship, the debate often falls, though not around these other grounds, not around sex discrimination or race discrimination or disability, but around Muslims. And when I began my talk, I said that the story really is one about the way in which liberal citizenship has or has not been remade in light of the multiculturalist critique. And one of the responses to that is the work of liberal political thinkers who argue that part of the resolution is to restate a stronger, more robust, more muscular form of liberalism. And Christian Jopka is an illustrative example of this. Because for Christian Jopka, Islam in Europe is qualitatively unique. He argues that in pious Muslims, in believing, practicing Muslims, there reverberates the archaic power of religion. Again, back to Ernest Gallner, where he's talked about secular resistant sentiments. Something which is not merely subjective belief, but objective truth, which cannot leave room for choice. That's a statement which is partly true of any pious religious person of any faith, to some extent. But what makes, I think, Jopka's account of Islam distinct is that he argues that Muslims in Europe have resurrected religious disputes from a bygone age, which to some extent should have been settled. So that they've unstitched historical peace compacts. And I suppose when I read this, I'm struck by the way in which Jopka and his argument for a liberal, a kind of a muscular liberalism, really taps into a set of well-established veins of animosity towards the prospects of Islam in Europe. If we think that there are optimists for the place of Islam in Europe, people who want to innovate through thinking about Euro-Islam and the way in which Islam can be reformulated within Western liberal contexts. Tariq Ramadan comes to mind, but there are many others. Well, there are also pessimists. And amongst those pessimists, we might include people like Mark Steyn and his book, America Alone, which was a New York Times bestseller. Now, Mark Steyn's title reflects his thesis that in a generation, it will be America alone, that the rest of Western Europe, and in his view, the kind of seedbed of liberal citizenship, will be conceded to an Islamic future. he sums it up where he says, arriving at a time of demographic, political, and cultural weakness, Muslims are profoundly changing Europe. Islam has youth and will. Europe has age and welfare. Put differently, pre-modern Islam beats postmodern Christianity. And he takes an especially, I think, perverse turn where he invokes, remember this is the New York Times bestseller, invokes what happened in the Balkans as an illustrative outcome. He says, well, look, why did Bosnia collapse into the worst slaughter in Europe since World War II? He says it's because of the demography. Muslims are more fertile than their European counterparts. And the Serbs figured out that, as the Continentals will in the years ahead, if you can't outbreed them, cull them. And I think the pessimistic reading of an Islamic future in Europe takes the form of assuming that Muslims engage in bad faith, which is the Yopka argument, but also that they're a demographic challenge, which is a kind of a further strand, I think, of the pessimist view. But it kind of has a long provenance. You think about people like Benjamin Kidd, who was writing at the turn of the century, and Benjamin Kidd did a lot to connect whiteness and the idea of the Western. We take the two to be, intertwined, go hand in hand. Well, actually, in the historical literature, whiteness and Western aren't used interchangeably until relatively recently. But Benjamin Kidd was very concerned that this kind of small continent and its kind of contribution to civilization would be eviscerated in time with the migration of North Africans into Europe and so on. So there's a long strand of what we might call the Eurabia panic, which doesn't begin with Christian Yopka and doesn't begin with Mark Stein, but it repeats something from their kind of repertoires. We find it too in the work of people like Christopher Caldwell, Reflections on the Revolutions in Europe. Now he's writing as an American, and he's taken the title that an English parliamentarian took to write about the French revolutions, Reflections on the Revolutions in France, and I've forgotten who that was. But he's an English parliamentarian, conservative parliamentarian, and they were almost like dispatches home. And Christopher Caldwell is doing similar ways, kind of writing to an American audience and saying, hey, look, what's going on in Europe. Again, part of this kind of Eurabia trajectory. Well, clearly, I don't think... I think it's an error to view Muslims as practitioners of Islam as being any more incapable of making peace with liberal democratic values than Christians or with Jews or other groups. And I suppose what I want to show in this slide is that most liberal democracies accommodate some religious pluralism. And that normally takes place within quite existing church-state relations. And if we take these three prominent examples, we can see how this works even within societies where the church and the state are completely decoupled. So in the UK, we have an established Church of England. It's a Protestant church. One of the implications, actually, is that even though the head of state, in our case the monarch, is the head of the church, civil society in the UK is incredibly secular. And it's very hard to be a pious religious politician and be taken seriously. I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, I'm just observing it to be the case. A few years ago, when Tony Blair was making one of his arguments for intervention in one of the countries that he was intervening in, he made a speech to television, and his press officer stopped him from saying, "God bless you," at the end of it. It's a very secular society, and, in addition to my anecdote, we have quite robust attitude survey data on this. But Britain is an established church, whereas the US, which has no establishment, has formally a wall of separation, has a very strong and mobilized religious interest in civil society. It's very hard to be an American politician without invoking God. But I'm just trying to illustrate with those two examples, even though they're radically different, they both have strands of religious pluralism which allow them to accommodate newer religious groups. And in fact, the success of Catholics and Jews in North America and Catholics and Jews in the UK within these different configurations actually have been a means through which newer religious minorities, not only, but not least Muslims, have made comparable claims for accommodation. They've made peace with liberal democratic norms. I put France on there too, because even though we think about France as being a secular republic, it's kind of actively secular, but it does have this kind of direct one-to-one relationship with religions. It funds particular kinds of religious schools in the way that the US doesn't. The federal government doesn't fund religious schools. So I show that to say that there's a space within existing configurations of church and state to accommodate Muslims in Europe in a way in which supports, I think, the optimist thesis rather than the pessimist thesis. So where does that leave us? Well, I suppose, firstly, that I guess that the work undertaken by different kinds of multiculturalists in debates over remaking national identity across different national contexts, including in terms of, making common membership meaningful, need to be understood as ongoing tasks. It was never the case that multicultural citizenship was time limited. Multiculturalists didn't say, give me 10 years and then all the problems will be solved. They said that if you want a meaningful form of liberal citizenship, one that includes minorities in it and allows minorities to see themselves as part of something, well, then you need to make accommodations and incorporate them. But that takes time, it takes generations. Sometimes we point to the Canadian example as being a success. I think the UK example, despite the way in which our Prime Minister has been very hostile to the language of multiculturalism, I think the UK is a success too. When we look at survey data, we find that the two groups who are most likely to self-identify as British first are ethnic minorities in England and Protestants in Northern Ireland. Other groups will identify either as English first, in Scotland, Scottish first, in Wales, Welsh first. But the people who are batting for England are the post-Windrush, post-45 generation of ethnic minorities. Secondly, I think that if people who are broadly advocating a kind of a cosmopolitanist frame, if it's true that European societies are becoming even more plural or super diverse, as people like Steve Vertevec and others have argued, then I think those advocates for pluralist integration need to build on past successes rather than trying to seek that erasure. So when interculturalists say that multiculturalism has failed, I think they need to point out also where multiculturalism has succeeded, because so much of the interculturalist agenda relies upon a multiculturalist argument. I think that in both theory and practice, liberal citizenship, equality and diversity, go hand in hand. And liberal citizenship can advocate a program of equal treatment without treating people equally, without registering and accommodating features of cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity. Conversely, registering diversity alone without talking about equality is, I think, a very insufficient means of talking about socioeconomic difference and other kinds of political inequalities. I think liberals better need to register that disadvantage is sometimes experienced differently by different groups. And moreover, this can't really be overcome by policies which are solely targeted towards the individual in a manner that ignores how sometimes disadvantage occurs at the group level. I think that experience throughout the European Union shows that some of the most effective public policies are those which take community context into account. And I think a genuinely democratic public sphere can only thrive if minorities, as well as majorities, feel confident enough to participate and be audible enough to participate and contribute. And importantly, that includes religious minorities too. And I suppose that brings us back onto the role of religion, where I'd like to end, which is to say that Europe is, whether the pessimists, the Eurabia proponents like it or not, Europe is increasingly religiously diverse. And I would argue that more often than not, it has given religion a place in the public square. Now, new religious minorities shouldn't be deterred from developing publicly recognized infrastructures, spaces, organizations, institutions. Not least because I think they can generate forms of civil society capital that are able to contribute to the well-being of society as a whole, but also sustain and develop a meaningful notion of liberal citizenship. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Okay.